Hey everyone, good day to all of you. Hope you're all doing well. I wanted to do a video today talking about Picatinny rail covers. Just a few weeks ago I did a video talking about Manta Defense's M-Lock rail covers in particular, and had a question on there asking if I could do a video just on all sorts of Picatinny rail covers, and I thought, sure, why not? Because I have a ton of them and have a lot to talk about with them as kind of a series of micro reviews and somewhat a comparison. That's what this video is going to be. So we're going to get started. Just to understand the scope of this video, I'm purely talking about these sorts of things like this right here. This is one from Manta as well. I'm going to be talking about a lot of ladder rail covers and a bunch of the more kind of exotic versions of just Picatinny rail covers in between, but I'm not going to be talking too much about actual rail wraps, for example. I did a video in the past on Manta's tack wrap, which if you want to check that out, I think it's pretty good, but ultimately for myself, I've kind of moved away from rail wraps. I've really only ever had the tack wrap to begin with, but for me, I personally like keeping it a little bit more minimal, something like this, because these are a lot easier to just remove, put back on, because, as a review channel mostly here, because I like to mess around with my rifles a lot, there's a lot of changes I constantly make. So having ease of removal, installation, the modularity of all these parts is really important to me, and that's just something I don't really like about rail wraps, is they get in the way. For example, that tack wrap in particular blocks a lot, even though I like it as a standalone item. It's just kind of a lot going on. Though on that same note, there are a few kind of interesting rail wraps that have some ways to kind of get around this. That don't block everything, so you can't put lights and stuff there, that I might check out in the future. But for this video, yeah, just going to be these sorts of things right here. So starting out with the, probably I would say my favorite at this point in time is going to be the Manta. I think these are the super or ultra low profile ones. What this means is just, so they make several versions of this for us to understand, and they're all fairly similar in how they attach the rail and how they're set up. It's just this one sits very low to the rail. They have another version that has a central raised portion which you can use to route cables through. I don't have any of those, but I do have their wire guides, which basically is the same thing, just cut down. You can see this is essentially just one little segment. It covers, it pretty much just clips into one slot, but you can see it covers pretty much two of these, and then the one flat right there. So personally, I don't really like using any of the Picatinny rail covers that have a center-fed rail guide. I use a lot of Picatinny rail covers that have a rail guide, but usually I prefer the offset one. I think a lot of the modern lasers, and flashlights, and pressure pads and everything, they tend to put the cable off to the side. In the case of this one, of course, you can see, and this is a different rail cover, which I'm going to get to in a bit, but I know that there are still some pressure pads out there, like the OEM Surefire pressure pad does go kind of towards the center. So this will be really depending on just how you're set up. But for me, since I pretty much exclusively have mod buttons and these sorts of setups, that I don't have any use for these types. Though I do own a fair amount of center-fed rail guides that I'll discuss. Just kind of happened across them over the years. Now as for Manta's rail covers themselves, if you're familiar with Manta's other offerings, very similar sort of thing. It's sort of a rubbery texture, though this is actually polymer, a very good heat resistance. Feels sort of like silicone-ish, but again, this is actually just polymer. And this is a pretty interesting setup. So if you look, let me flip it this way, you can see you actually have these cut lines. So you can actually trim this down, but it's not like 100%. You can't snip just a tiny bit off. And the reason for that is between every one of these cut lines, if you kind of see molded into the polymer, is these actually have a lot of internal, just very thin, sort of like a spring steel that clips on and holds onto the rail really, really securely. And you basically have this sort of over molded, almost like a recoil lug here, you can see, that keeps repeating. And yeah, these just hold in remarkably well, even though they're this sort of texture that you might not think would hold in very well, just because it's sort of just squishy and rubbery, might slide around, but this doesn't. It is extremely, an extremely good fit. And one other interesting thing is you can actually take these clips here and you can kind of pry them apart a little bit or push them more in, depending on if you have a slightly out of spec Picatinny rail, and it'll fit absolutely everything really tightly that way. The way it clips on as well is very simple. You just kind of slide one part over that ledge of the rail and then just push down. You can hear it clicking in there. That's each of those little metal clips actually sitting in there, and then just kind of pushing this down, and that's how simple it is to just take on and off. And again, this is not going anywhere at all on its own. You can see it doesn't want to slide back and forth. in the slightest, even with a lot of pressure applied. Only thing I would say is if you're really OCD, this doesn't sit flat. It kind of is supposed to mimic the look of a Picatinny rail section here. Obviously you can see with the raised sections, lower sections, all that. But yeah, it's pretty irregular there. I've never seen one of these be perfectly straight, so it doesn't matter at all as far as actual function, just looks a little off. And if you really care, you can massage these into place a little bit. As you can see, this one's already starting to look a lot more straight right there. So moving now to the ladder rail covers, which I think pretty much everyone is familiar with, and these work great. Generally, for me, the reason I like to use a lot of rail covers is twofold. First off, the biggest one is that it protects your rail from damage, of course. So if you're bumping into things a lot, it just makes sure that you can't get these deformed or anything. And the other reason that I really like a lot of rail covers is so that the rail stays temperature neutral, whether I'm in extreme cold weather, which I swear is most of the year around here, or if I'm in the heat, then of course, again, it stays a lot more comfortable to put my hand on. Ladder rail covers are a lot more minimalist, of course. They don't really do either of those too well. They give a slightly more comfortable gripping surface, and of course they provide a little bit of protection, but of course it's pretty much just half of the protection because it's just skeletonized. As far as the various different ladder rail covers are out there, if you do want to pick these up, I run a lot of these myself. Just depends on the occasion. For example, you can see down here on this rail segment, usually on my 6 o'clock rail segments for a bipod, I usually just put this, just because it does sit a lot more low profile. I don't need a huge Manta rail cover. You know, even though this is called their super low profile version, it does still stick out a fair bit there, you can see. So just something like this just sits a little lower. That way if I'm bracing off this when I don't have a bipod attached, which is a fair bit of the time, then it's just a little cleaner there. I've noticed a lot of variance in the specs of different ladder rail covers. So this one right here is an older Zenico one that I got prior to all the sanctions and everything. And frankly, these fit okay on Zenico's own handguards and rails, but even then it's not great. The problem I have with this one is you can see how squishy it is, how much it wants to deform. You might think that'll hold it to the rail better, but actually it doesn't. Under recoil, this thing always wants to slip out, and usually I'm having to pop in the end again just so it doesn't fall out. What I would recommend, that I've had by far the best luck with, is the Ergo grips. You can see right here. The Ergo grips ladder rail covers are excellent. Of course, these are very easy to trim to size as well. This is an Ergo grips section right here. And you can see they're a lot more rigid. I'm applying significantly more force here than I even was to the Zenico, and you can just see how little it wants to deform. These hold very well. They're always a nice tight fit, while also not being ridiculously tight either, to where they're not difficult to take off. I have tried a lot of different ladder rail covers. I have some green, just totally random ones that I picked up on eBay a few years ago that I don't even know who made them, but they work well. But again, if you pick up just a random one, you might get something that's as bad as this, or you might get something that's really solid. For example, like I said, those green ones are really close in quality to these Ergo grips, but not quite. I like the Ergo grips. They're great as far as quality. They have pretty much every single color you could imagine underneath the sun. Just really a preference thing. If you like ladder rail covers, then yeah, that's what I would say to go with as far as those are concerned. Next type of rail cover I wanted to talk about is the LaRue index clips. So I do have one up on that 416A5 up here that you were looking at earlier, but I also have quite a few on this upper that I wanted to show. So I have, there's several different variants of it, and you can see I just have 5 of them right here. How these work, they're just a tiny little clip. They just clip into one little Picatinny section, and I have just a bunch of them right here. So the reason I have so many is just to really nicely and cleanly guide this cable out of the mod button right there. So you have a standard version, which is this back one right here. You can see, of course, it's just a crossbar clip. This does have a section cut out in the center, so you can actually, even on these standard clips, you can actually run a center fed wire through any of these. But then they also have these 2 other versions. So you have a hook type, which is this second from the furthest back right here, where you can actually push the cable into and it retains it. And then you also have this kind of just covered version, which is these front 3. Once the camera focuses there. And this just kind of helps to hold the cable in place so it doesn't push up. This doesn't actually retain it as compared to the hook version, which you can see it actually kind of opens up the polymer right there on the index clip itself and really holds this securely. Again, not overly securely. You can pull this out by hand if you want, and you can see it's starting to come out right there. Just going to pop that back in there. So these are great. The only complaints I have about the index clips, so the most minor is it does leave a little bit of a gap between each, if you care. That's very minor. Some of the more big issues is just the way you can purchase these. Unfortunately, they only offer them in extremely large sets, and I never really end up using that many clips. I have, I think, over 100 of these just random clips just kind of sitting around in a box. I do wish they'd have an option to just buy, say, like 20 of the hook types or 20 of the covered types. I'm forgetting the exact name they use for it. Just the one that kind of holds the cable down, like these three. The sets that you can buy just have a ton of these standard versions, like the back one here, and then they have a very limited number of the hook and covered types, like those up there holding the cable. And then the last complaint I have about these is they don't all have the best finish. I think they just take these off of pretty much like a sprue tree, almost like you're doing like a plastic model. And so some of these will have like a little bit of a spike sticking out of polymer that is easy to cut down. You can just use like a nail cutter or a Dremel, anything, very easy to take that off, but it is there. You need to kind of feel around for it when you first get these. But the index clips are nice. You can see how low profile they sit on the rail itself, you know, using this 416A5 again for reference. You can see how close it sits to the mod button, how low it sits on the pick rail itself. A lot of good things going for them. Next type of rail cover I wanted to talk about is the just generic rubber type that you see in pretty much every sporting goods store, every online store. These are dirt cheap. They're made by every knockoff company under the sun. I've never really had good luck with these. These like to shift around a lot, even though they do have, or at least this one has, what looks like kind of a lug sort of thing right here. It doesn't work great. These have a lot of flex to them, so again, under recoil, they do like to shift. I've never had one come off the rail completely, but again, they do shift quite a bit. So putting one onto here, just for an example, you can see it goes on there easy. But you can see even with minimal force, this just wiggles around on its own. Now on some rails, it'll have a bit more play to it, just depending on the measurements of your exact rail and how closely to spec it was made. There's actually a lot of variance even in the real Picatinny specs, so you'll see a lot of differences as far as how this attaches, so not really great there. These don't have any method, of course, at all to retain a cable either. Now one similar version of these that I did want to talk about that I don't currently have on hand, but I used to have a ton of them, is the Magpul XTM. They're a sort of hard polymer with a texture to them, essentially exactly the same as Magpul's grips, but I've never been a fan of those. Said a lot in previous rail cover videos, kind of complaining about the difficulty on installing them, but I don't think any rail cover I've used comes close to the annoyance of trying to remove the Magpul XTMs. They are particularly difficult to remove, but I've also seen a lot of variants. So for example, a long time ago, had a DPMS Oracle with Midwest Industries, just one of those drop-in type of handguards on there. And the issue I was running into with those XTMs is some of them actually ended up falling off under recoil. Now there are some tricks that you can use to take those ones off a bit easier, but I just figure, especially in this day and age when there is so many different options, I don't really see the point in going with those Magpul XTMs. They were just kind of, I guess, kind of popular in 2010s or like 2007-ish. It showed up a lot in magazines and stuff on different builds, but really, as far as actually using them, I'm not a big fan. And last, just very small, wanted to talk about the Strike Industries rail cover and also cable management guide here. Never been a huge fan of these. I picked up a kit, one of the NGSW kits that had a bunch of these plus their M-LOK rail covers, and that's why I have this, but it was kind of cool to just experiment with. So the cable management on this, it's kind of a lot going on with it. So first off, you do have these sides right here you can see where you can run a cable straight through, just like on the index clips, for instance, from LaRue. But you also have a way where you can take a side-fed cable, for example, right here, and you could run it all the way through to the other side of the clip. So I've never really ran into a situation, at least not yet, where I need to do that. I'm sure there are some niche setups. For example, if you're running a dual lead mod button or just remote switch, then depending on how you have things mounted, this might work, especially if you have like a center mounted IR laser up here, then I know things can get kind of weird in that regard. So maybe that'll work a bit better there. Other than that, I mean, these do hold pretty securely to the rail. I'll go ahead and clip it on here right now so you can see. And this is just a hard polymer, not really any extra texture to it. If anything, I find these to be on the overly tight side just a bit, as you can probably tell as I struggle to put this on around the camera. There we go. You can hear that click in. So yeah, I mean, these aren't really going anywhere. They hold the cable securely. I'm not really a big fan of how they look, and also as far as the practical appearance, this does have some gloss to it, which is never great. Of course, you can spray paint it, so not the worst, but again, that's a little bit extra you would need to do when there's other rail covers that exist on the market. Kind of why bother? So that's all the rail covers I have experience with. I know that one of the pretty obvious ones that's missing here that I know a lot of people used to use back in the day was like the hard polymer rail covers, the really big ones, for example, the Knight's Armament that you always saw on the M4s and the Tango Down ones. And pretty much every company had their own copies of them, HK, LWRC, just everyone, really. I haven't tried those myself, which is kind of funny because personally, when you talk about like a pistol grip, I usually prefer just a hard polymer. I hate rubberized pistol grips, but as far as rail covers are concerned, I actually really do like the Manta setup where it has that little bit of squish to it. It's just kind of nice. And again, these work great to protect the rail from bumps or anything. With that little bit of squish to it, the rail cover itself is also remarkably durable from bumps because it just kind of springs back from everything. But same goes for the ladder rail covers. Again, this is just a bit less protection overall, but those would be my two favorites. My two recommendations would be either the Mantas or the Ergo grips in particular, I should say, ladder rail covers. So I hope that this was informative. If you have any other questions or you want to add your own experience with, I'm sure, you know, the huge amount of other rail covers that are out there, I'd love to hear it. By all means, please do leave those in the comments below. I'll always read them. And if nothing else, appreciate you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Take care. See you then.